Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I am joined by Keith Preston to continue our series on American foreign policy. I think right now we're going to begin with Vietnam. We left off right with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Vietnam is so decisive in American political and strategic and social thinking. It was kind of a flagship, era or a bellwether moment where, for both the new left and the right and the Democratic and Republican parties, everything kind of revolves in the post World War II era around various interpretations of Vietnam. And to preface this, before U.S. intervention officially in 1965 by Lyndon Johnson, the lead up to all of this again goes back to the Second World War when the OSS was founding not the Khmer Rouge, the Ho Chi Minh's forces. So we probably funded the Khmer Rouge. I wouldn't be surprised if we did. Um, And then in the 50s, when the French had their counterinsurgency against them, against the communist forces. Now, one claim that's made comes up specifically in the firing line interview with Noam Chomsky. Chomsky claims that the U.S. Policy was to preserve the French Empire in Indochina, which, again, I think on the face of it seems laughable, given that the French Empire collapsed in Indochina. And the one thing that might have saved them at Dien Bien Phu, Operation Vulture, where U.S. Bombers from the Philippines would bombard forces of the Viet Cong and the NVA, we didn't do it. We were already placing bets on when it was going to fall. So I don't really buy that. But when the French were defeated, it was 1954 at the Geneva Peace Conference. Vietnam was divided between North and South. And almost as soon as that treaty was ended, the North began its attempt to undermine and subvert all of Indochina. In '58, it invaded Laos and overthrew with the aid of the Pathet Lao to overthrow the legitimate government of Laos. The Laos and Cambodia in the Geneva Treaty were considered neutral nations, and yet the Ho Chi Minh Trail went through Laos and Cambodia. I think beginning in '63, the United States under JFK sent advisors to the South Vietnamese forces under Diem. No, Diem was, in my estimation, one of the only leader that could have probably united South Vietnam, because after he was assassinated by Johnson, South Vietnam didn't have a stable government from then on until the end of the conflict itself. And it seems, from what I can tell, the main reason why we offed Diem was because he, being a local strongman, didn't want to be seen as relying upon U.S. forces to fight his war with the communists. He wanted our aid and our expertise, but he didn't want U.S. troops there. And we wanted to intervene in a more direct way because we believed that Diem was not capable of handling the communist threat. And we go in after we assassinate Diem, we go in '65 and begin the longest war. Well, actually, the second longest war in U.S. history. I think Afghanistan now takes the title of the longest. And one of the lessons that we had not learned from previous counterinsurgencies, especially the very successful one in Malaya, was the use of strategic hamlets. Now, this isn't like Boer concentration camps like we saw in the Boer War or in the Philippines in the early 20th century, but more relocation settlements like in Malaya in the 1950s, which was extremely successful in destroying the communist insurgents in Malaya. Such attempts were prepared by Diem, but due to corruption were not as effective as they might otherwise have been. And the United States just canned more or less the entire operation as a whole, which I think was a miscalculation from a strategic point of view, because that was what actually was so successful in Malaya, and also I think in the Philippines in the 1950s when we fought the Hooks. But regardless, the United States then began the 10-year conflict in Vietnam, which created a great amount of unrest at home. I don't think there's ever been a opposition to a U.S. war like that before or since. Split the country apart. And one of the things that's interesting is that the neoconservative historian Max Boot argues that this idea that you lose the war at home due to national unrest and people losing the will to fight actually begins with the American Revolution, when the British Parliament and the British people were not interested in prosecuting the war as well. in the United States. But that is crucial because we see now that popular opinion wins wars. It's possibly apocryphal, but I remember hearing that Kissinger, when he was at the peace accord in '75 with Lee Duc-Tho from North Vietnam, said that that you never won a single battle against U.S. forces, and Lee Duc-Tho says you're right, but it doesn't matter. So, what were some of your thoughts, Keith, on Vietnam and the influence that it had on U.S. policy and culture?
Well, I think it's one of the most important events in American history, and I think it, in many ways, was a world transformative event in the sense that prior to the Vietnam War in the domestic United States, there was certainly a tradition of there being anti-war movements, and there had been opposition to World War II with America First. There had been opposition to World War I. There had been opposition to the Civil War. But this, I think, had a transformative effect in the sense that it was the first time that there was an anti-war movement in the United States that essentially won. I think that one of the most significant things about the Vietnam War from the point of view of domestic American politics is that you had a war that was essentially ended because of popular opposition in the domestic society. As you were saying, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese did not necessarily perform that well against American forces fighting in Vietnam. That's still being debated about by American and foreign military historians. But from my reading of what happened in the Vietnam War, the war became so unpopular that there was really no popular will to continue the war. And one thing that's particularly interesting about it is that it really had the effect, I think, of ending the possibility of conscription into future wars in the United States. One thing that era was known for was the anti-draft protest, and because the anti-draft movement became so successful and so popular, the draft was ended, and that had the effect of ending the war. And even though the United States has certainly involved itself in foreign war since then, it's been done in a much different way. That war had the impact of making foreign war so unpopular, and certainly making the draft so unpopular, that ever since then the United States has had to fight foreign war largely through proxy efforts, either through the use of professional military on one hand, or just as frequently through proxy armies or through covert methods that really took away the state's ability to field mass armies of conscripts. The American government hasn't been able to do that since then, which is a major, I think, really a major transformative effect in the whole society, the whole culture, the whole foreign policy apparatus. And it had a worldwide impact as well. The opposition to the war in Vietnam was not just in the United States, it was all over the world. You had anti-Vietnam War protests everywhere, all throughout Europe and in Latin America and in other places as well. So it's something of a time when the idea of total war between states is starting to go out of vogue. After World War II, nuclear weapons were invented, and that raised the cost of wars between states. And the United States got into some regional wars with the Koreans, with the North Koreans, with the North Vietnamese in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. But that was in many ways one of the last major wars. Vietnam was really one of the last major wars between states. Well, we had the Iraq War, but and we've had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and things like that. But it did have this kind of transformative effect where in many ways it seemed to delegitimize imperialist war, interventionist war in many ways, on many levels. It certainly decreased its popularity. And also the idea of the conscript army, it seems to have delegitimized that as well, which is very significant as an historical event. In fact, it's always seemed to me that a lot of contemporary commentators and historians underplay the significance of the Vietnam War in terms of its impact on the world, and not just on American society, but on the world as a whole. I think it was really an important, very important historic event.
Oh, yes, exactly. One thing that's also unique about the Vietnam War is in American historiography, it's one of the few cases where the far hard left has won the narrative battle. Whereas, for instance, the Iraq War, it's in the War on Terror, it's largely split down the middle along sectarian partisan lines, whereas Vietnam is almost a byword for a disaster. It's the bad war. If World War II was the good war, Vietnam was the bad war. But one of the things about the two most famous leftist pundits in America, hard left, that pushed this narrative were Noam Chomsky and Mark Herman. I think it was Mark Herman.
Edward Herman. Edward
Yeah,
Herman.
yeah, and their attempts to legitimate the Khmer regime and the Ho Chi Minh regime. Well, one thing that needs to be just stated up front is that this ludicrous notion that Ho Chi Minh or Pol Pot were nationalists and were at any point not, at any point they could have been possibly wooed by the West away from communism. These people were hardcore communists trained in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. The idea that these leaders could have ever been wooed to the West is just laughable. And if you go to a place like Marxist.org and read the literature of these people, they're self-consciously, very early on, Marxists and Leninists. Later on, of course, you get Stalinism and Maoism influencing them as well, where Pol Pot's more of a Maoist and Ho Chi Minh is more of a Leninist. But regardless of the fact that these regimes, these guerrilla forces that later set up regimes in Indochina, were never going to consider peaceful coexistence with the West or Western forces. They might infight amongst themselves, as Vietnam did when they invaded Cambodia in 75, 76. But the other thing, too, is if you look at, I think in the mid-50s, at 54 to 56, there was a massive exodus from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, where something like 500,000 to 2 million refugees fled south. And then, of course, that was repeated again 20 years later with the boat people, where about 2 million people fled to Thailand and the Philippines, and ultimately, if possible, the United States. And this really shows that the leftist narrative, the Jane Fondas, the Noam Chomskys, that these were somehow democratic people's paradises, is just farcical. You don't have 2 million people flee a country if it's a paradise. Whereas for all of the corruption and misgovernment of the South Vietnamese regime, systematic genocide was not necessarily a hallmark of that regime. In many ways, the South Vietnamese regime is analogous to the nationalist Chinese during World War II. They had yet to develop a national identity. They were largely corrupt. There was this infighting between them. I think Diem would be the closest they had to a Chiang Kai-shek figure, a figure who could steer a course for South Vietnam and make it something workable. And of course, we assassinated him. But I think the real cost is once the South Vietnam was lost and once Cambodia and Laos were conquered by the Pathet Lao and the Khmer Rouge, something on the order of 4 or 5 million people died under regimes of extreme savagery that would could only be rivaled by the Maoist terror of the 50s and 60s. You've pointed out before, Keith, that, and you want to comment on it as well, is that these third world, these East Asian communist regimes were often more savage than Stalin or Lenin.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. If you look at the history of communism from the time of the Russian Revolution 100 years ago in 1917, all through, well, even up to today, the handful of states like that still exist. What you see if you really start adding up the body counts generated by these regimes is that it's mostly the Asian communist regime that were the most lethal. It was certainly Maoism and also Kimism, Hoism, Pol Potism. We could say that Stalinism in Russia and in Eastern Europe during Stalin's actual lifetime, or certainly during the height of the purges, from I guess with the early 30s up through the late 40s, something like that. We could say that that time period, Stalinism rivaled some of the things that later went on in Asian communism, and of course the starving of the Ukraine and all of that. But when Asian communist powers start coming to power with Kim Il Sung in 48, and then Mao in 49, and then later in the 70s Viet Minh and the Pathet Lao and the Khmer Rouge, they really ratchet it up to a whole new level. I mean, you really do have a situation where they're trying to level the whole society in many ways, and through doing that, they literally kill millions upon millions of people. The body count, for example, that was generated by Maoist China is believed to have been the largest generated by any state in history. Probably as many as 65 million people, by some estimates. And that was through a combination of outright state-sponsored purges, murders, terrorism, executions, deaths in labor camps, and things like that, as well as people that died through starvation, largely as a result of state-organized famines, because they pursued such off-the-wall economic policies. I mean, they would actually do things in Maoist China, like they had this idea they were going to industrialize China by having people, forge metal and stoves in their backyard or something like that. So this is during the collectivization projects, doing things like the Great Leap Forward. That's the kind of stuff they used to try to impose on the society. So you're dealing with a system of rule that's ruled by crazy people, essentially. And that was repeated in Cambodia itself is an interesting case because, as you said, the Cambodians were a Maoist influenced regime. They took even that to a whole new level. They wanted to purge Cambodia of anything that had been tainted by Western influence. So anyone that had a Western education, they killed them. People that they thought were too bourgeois and not properly in touch with the land and all that, they killed them. They would kill people for wearing glasses. They were also racially motivated. They killed a lot of ethnic Chinese and even ethnic Vietnamese. One thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is some of the motives behind the killing field. I mean, it's beyond the ideological motives, which were certainly there as well. But one of the things that the Khmer Rouge wanted to do was, because Cambodia was still an agrarian society, they wanted to rapidly industrialize Cambodia. And they thought they were going to be able to repeat what Stalin had done in Russia. And they took a lot of cues from the Great Leap Forward as well. But they had this idea that people still wonder, well, why did they march everybody out of the cities and have everybody working 20 hours a day farming rice and stuff like that? The motivation behind that was that was their only major export crop. Like Cambodia at the time had rice as its only major export product. So they wanted to produce as much rice as they could and sell it on the world market, with this idea that they were going to use the revenue generated by that to purchase industrial equipment and import industrial equipment from the outside world into Cambodia for the purpose of starting to industrialize Cambodia. They even had I once read it once about how in 1970, I think it was in 1976, after they had been in power for about a year, they actually had a party at the headquarters of the leadership of the Khmer Rouge, where they had a big banner they displayed that said, we will be an industrial society by the year 2000 or something like that, or whatever the objective was, or 1990 or something, whatever they had set as their goal. So again, it was like the Great Leap Forward. It was just this absolutely insane crackpot idea they had about how they were going to rapidly industrialize their society using all these kinds of really way out methods. One thing, though, about the American intervention in the region during that time period is that one of the effects that the American intervention had was that it disrupted the civil societies of the Southeast Asian countries to the point that I think had the effect of strengthening the communists in the long run. With Diem, the issue with the United States and Vietnam, I don't agree with Chomsky's idea that the United States was trying to preserve the French Empire. I do think that the United States saw the old European colonial empires as something that it would bring into the United States' own sphere of influence, but the United States saw itself as the rightful heirs to the old colonial empires and wanted to bring all those old colonies into the American sphere of influence as client states, and they were trying to do that in South Vietnam as well. And one thing about Diem is that Diem was a Catholic, and he was, which was a problem in a majority Buddhist society, and he was big on pushing Catholicism. And there were also a lot of other groups in South Vietnam, large religious communities, some of which were indigenous Catholic communities, but some of which were Buddhist, some of whom belonged to the what's called the Cao Dao religion, which is sort of a hybrid of Christianity and Buddhism, I think, plus some other stuff. But some of these groups actually had their own anti-communist militias and things like that that were fighting the Viet Cong as well in the period before the American intervention. One thing that Diem tried to do was, instead of trying to strengthen and build up some of these groups as a resistance force to the communists, because what was going on with the communists is you had a communist guerrilla insurgency going on in South Vietnam with the Viet Cong, but it was also being backed by the North Vietnamese and by proxy by the major communist powers, the Soviets and the Chinese as well. So what Diem was trying to do was, on one hand, he wanted to certainly suppress the communist insurgency, but he also wanted to eliminate any centers of power that he thought would potentially pose a threat to his own rule. So he was trying to consolidate his own rule over the society, in part by, he wanted to Catholicize the country. He wanted to eliminate these militias and other organizations that were actually fighting against the communists. He tried to suppress those as well. And so he was sort of caught between a rock and a hard place, because he didn't want the communists then. He didn't want all these competing centers of power. He wanted to establish himself as a strongman ruler over Vietnam, but he didn't want the Americans in either. So he was really getting it from all ends. And the Americans did not like the fact, as you were pointing out, that he didn't want the Americans involved. So they more or less took him out and had someone put in that would invite the Americans in. And that, I think, is really the beginning of the end. It's really the beginning of the end of South Vietnam as an independent nation. After that, it was just a puppet of the United States. And also, it was really the beginning of the end of the South Vietnamese government having any appearance of legitimacy. That's one of the problems that it had in South Vietnam itself, that a lot of South Vietnamese, whatever they thought of the North or whatever they thought of the Viet Cong, the government of President Diem was not perceived to have any kind of legitimacy, or the post-Diem. Well, there was a lot of popular opposition to Diem as well, but the post-Diem governments that existed in Vietnam, they were not perceived as legitimate by the Vietnamese people. They were seen as American puppet governments. So that was a problem also. And then, so you had this situation where civil society is being eradicated. There's an inability to form a legitimate government that's perceived as legitimate in the South. You have the Vietnamese people who don't want the Americans there, but they don't want the communists there either. There's also this effort to undermine any effort to resist the communists that might have actually been successful. So the writing was pretty much on the wall for the Vietnamese after that. It was pretty much inevitable that Saigon was going to fall eventually, that Vietnam was going to be reunified under communist rule.
Yeah, I tend to agree that the assassination of Diem was the turning point. Another problem in this whole conflict from the point of the West was that this was in the center of gravity of communism. China, one of the largest backers, of course, the Soviets as well. China's right next door to North Vietnam. The United States has to travel across the entire Pacific Ocean. And with the other thing as well is that the U.S. aid in South Vietnam was very sketchy. Not surprising, given our sketchy aid to the nationalists and our sketchy aid to the whites in the Russian Civil War. We'll make deals and then renege on them. Whereas the communists don't renege on their deals. They give you guns, they give you ammunition, they give you tanks and airplanes, and you get them. And so the whole logistical hurdle was a big problem. And this gets into the problem of limited conflicts. The United States is very good at winning a total war between nation states, where we just go in there and we just level a place like maybe the Romans did or something, and then take over. When we fight a war with limited objectives, limited goals, and of course because other great powers are involved, we can't. Certain strategies are just off the table. We weren't really still aren't capable of waging these wars successfully. Europeans have had centuries of experience waging limited wars for limited goals. And Vietnam really showed the limitations of U.S. strategic thinking and its inability to do so. But the real problem with South Vietnam as well in winning that conflict was, again, the porous borders, the jungles, and the fact that the communists were more than willing to violate the rights of neutrals like Laos and Cambodia, were more than willing to dump a near limitless amount of supplies into the region. And they didn't have to worry about popular dissent or unrest because they would just run the tanks in like at Tiananmen Square and Prague and it's all over. The United States had to worry about those considerations. But one is struck, though, by to be charitable, the naivete, to be uncharitable, the treachery of the American left, that they could actually believe the publications of the North Vietnamese. There's this one unbelievable piece in the Chomsky website, I think it was like 65, 66, where he's on, no, it's probably a bit later, probably 67, but he was on this tour of a Potemkin village. These happy Vietnamese children are singing and they're at school and they're learning how to read and write. And he writes back saying, oh yeah, like North Vietnam is this great paradise. And I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, how can you believe that? I mean, Stalin did the same thing in the 30s. He would build these Potemkin villages and have Western literati go there. And then, the actual starving peasants, you would never get to see them. Then you got Jane Fonda taking photo ops with the NVA. But what's so incredible is you could never imagine in World War II or Korea or World War I, even opponents of U.S. policy going to an enemy nation and doing photo ops with them or writing in American journals that we hope that the enemy nation defeats us. No, in World War II, you get thrown in jail. World War I, you get thrown in jail. Korea, probably nobody would listen to you. And even the left today doesn't advocate that Saddam was a good guy or that the Taliban were good guys in hopes that they're going to win. They just don't want the Americans to be involved. It really was unprecedented, this sort of like association with a foreign regime, and one so brutal as the North Vietnamese and the Cambodians. And it's really quite amazing that, especially after the blatant denials of Herman and Chomsky of the Pol Pot genocide, which eventually they had to admit occurred in the 80s, and their denial of the Chinese genocide and the North Vietnamese genocide in the 60s and 70s, that their careers as political analysts were not up in flames. It really is incredible how their political analyst careers survived. So, I mean, could you imagine if somebody on the right had denied the Holocaust and had been pushing for Hitler, and then he's like, okay, 1945, okay, yeah, you're right, guys, I was wrong. The guy will be totally discredited and no one would ever listen to him again. But apparently the new left is Teflon. Do you have any insights on that, Keith?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different aspects to that. During the Vietnam War, it was a time there were a lot of, as we know, in the domestic society, there was a great deal of liberalization of the wider society going on. And people were more and more calling into question, the establishment and the existing order of things. And we had civil rights going on, and we had the women's lib going on, and the environmental movement really began back then, and gay rights, and all of these different kinds of social and cultural upheavals were taking place at precisely the same time that the war in Vietnam was going on. And I think that while it's not true that there was not repression against the anti-war movement, there were something like 65 major conspiracy trials that happened in the late 60s and early 70s over different things that were largely related to that, to the war in Vietnam, and some domestic issues as well. But it's also true that people could speak against the war somewhat more openly than what would have been the case previously. And I think the reason for that was the society was becoming more and more fragmented at the time. You didn't really have a type of national unity government or culture in the way that there was during World War II. I think that was a big part of it. World War II, almost everyone viewed it as their patriotic duty to support the war and make their contribution to the war effort, even if they weren't in the military. Even elderly people today who lived through that will tell you that people would turn in their metal to be recycled for the war effort and things of that nature. It was a time very much when the unity and for a common purpose was emphasized. But in the Vietnam War, 25 years later, it certainly wasn't the case. The society domestically was starting to unravel a great deal. There was a great deal of divisiveness in the society over the war, plenty of other things at the same time. And I think that created a type of opening for political dissent to take place in a way that probably would not have been permitted in some of the earlier wars, like World War I or World War II. That's one thing. Another thing is that the way that the narrative was framed is that I remember in the I guess it was in the late 1980s, I used to read a lot of old radical literature from the 60s. And because I used to actually go to a used bookstore where I could find all these old New Left books and copies of old New Left newsletters and that kind of stuff from the 60s and early 70s. And one thing I remember about that stuff was that the way that they would frame the narrative was that the Vietnamese were like the Americans of 1776. That's how the New Left portrayed the war in Vietnam. The Vietnamese, the Vietnamese are like the Americans of 1776. They're fighting for their national independence, and now we the Americans, now we are King George III. It's like Nixon or Lyndon Johnson or whomever is the new King George III. So they tended to frame the narrative solely in terms of people fighting for their independence versus imperialists, as opposed to the establishment narrative, which was the Cold War narrative. The make the world safe for democracy against communism. That was a very, very shrewd propaganda technique, I think, on the part of the New Left, and because it seems to have worked very well. The idea that, the narrative was that this is a civil war between the North and South Vietnamese. We wouldn't have wanted Vietnamese fighting in the American Civil War, and this is the Vietnamese trying to gain their national independence. Here we are over there trying to keep them from doing that. Which, on a certain level, there's some truth to that. Now, the other side of it is, but who is it that's being fought against? The Ho Chi Minh government in North Vietnam was a hardline communist government. It was well known that was the case. That wasn't some secret. They were openly aligned with the major communist powers as well, and that was the other side of it. Now, I think that the way that the war was justified by the American establishment was in the name of the Cold War and anti-communism, by saying, a popular idea was what they called the domino theory, which was the idea, if the South Vietnam falls to the communists, they will become a Soviet puppet like the Cubans, and then the same thing will happen to the South Koreans and to the Taiwanese and to the Vietnamese, to the Japanese, and then the Philippines, and then Malaysia, and on down the line. The pro-war side in that war tried to frame it as the communists in Asia are the new Japanese. They're the new Imperial Japan. They're trying to take over the whole Pacific area, and they're in turn aligned with the world communist movement. So it's ultimately the Russians and the Chinese that are behind this. That was really the pro-war line, I think. The other, although the New Left was very successful in framing it as from an anti-imperialist perspective, or as a regional civil war. The As far as the genocides that happened, that's interesting because one thing that is the case is that there were writers in the United States that opposed World War II that were pretty much finished as public figures after that. One was H.L. Mencken. H.L. Mencken was like the George Will of his time. I mean, or David Brooks or someone like that. A very prominent newspaper columnist. And after he came out against World War II, he was more or less retired after that. I mean, he certainly lost a lot of standing because of that. Plus his health declined and all that as well. Another one was Lawrence Dennis. Lawrence Dennis was a very prominent public intellectual in the 1930s who openly opposed the war, World War II. He was actually put on trial as part of a sedition conspiracy under the Smith Act during the Second World War. And while the case ended in a mistrial, he was pretty much finished as well after that. There were also some anti-war people from the World War II era who were Holocaust revisionists, not because they were pro-Nazi or anti-Jewish per se, but because they were anti-war. Of course, one of the main arguments, even to this day, that's used to say that the World War II was the good war is the Holocaust. Like how can you be against fighting a regime that carries out something like the Holocaust? There are, and in the 70s, for example, you had people in the libertarian milieu. And among a lot of individualist anarchist types, like James J. Martin was one, who actually would promote Holocaust. Sam Konkin, who was the founder of agorism, those guys were actually interested in Holocaust revisionism, not necessarily on pro-Nazi grounds, but on anti-war grounds. I'm sure a lot of the left libertarians and other libertarians of today would freak out if they knew that history, but it's there. You can actually find it in a lot of old libertarian journals from that time period. It is interesting, though, that there were people like that. But the thing about communism and the way that leftist intellectuals can be apologists for communism and get away with it, I think has to do with the fact that the communist ideology sounds better rhetorically than some of these other things do. The communist ideology, they talk about how we're for peace and against poverty and all these high-minded ideals. Whereas Nazism is something that sounds sinister on the surface. It's basically a comic book villain ideology, and communism is too, but it doesn't come across that way quite as easily from a rhetorical level. And for that reason, I think a lot of communists and communist fellow travelers are able to get away with that to the degree that, say, Nazis and Nazi fellow travelers are not, because they're viewed as, well, they have good intentions, they're misguided. I even have debates about that today with leftists about stuff like that. When I point out, for example, that the Antifa are just as violent and terroristic and fanatical as their neo-Nazi opponents, people will say, yeah, but they're fighting against real injustices, or they mean well, or they think they're fighting against some terrible evil. Or a while back, I had a fellow who's an older fellow who's a well-known person in the left anarchist milieu, somewhat well-known, tell me that, yeah, but the Communist Party is not like the Klan. They don't go around murdering people. Well, they don't in societies where they don't hold power, but they do in societies where they do hold power. So there's always been this kind of double standard, when it comes to all of these kinds of issues. You find it all across the board, not just in international relations, but even with domestic things as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think when it comes to U.S. involvement in Vietnam, whether it was economic or in the early stages, giving advisors and equipment to up to the military intervention, I think that given the absolute catastrophe of human catastrophe of the communist victory, some grounds can be made for U.S. involvement. Now, to the degree that it can be debated. I think, like I agree with you, that getting rid of the M was a mistake. because DM was the best shot South Vietnam had for a stable government. But I don't see why, in principle, U.S. involvement in Vietnam could not have ended up like Korea, where we preserve a quasi-democratic society. Because, I mean, Syngman Rhee was kind of an authoritarian, but by the 80s, South Korea is a first world democratic country. I don't see any reason why South Vietnam could not have repeated that in principle, had certain mistakes not been made by the United States, and had the communist infiltration of. I mean, the communists would brag about their plants in the anti-war movement. They were what Lenin called useful idiots. You know, the VC of the North Vietnamese, you know, Po and To, you know, they're like, yeah, I mean, we know that these people are not necessarily hardline communists like us, but it doesn't matter, right? Because as long as they get the U.S. to pull out, we're going to win. That's something that we didn't have to deal with in Korea, which I think was decisive, ultimately decisive in the U.S. defeat. But again, I don't think in principle there's any reason why it couldn't have turned out like Korea had certain mistakes not been made. And that would have been, I think, a much better result than what actually happened. What actually happened was just a disaster all the way around, from, you know, the saturation bombing of the U.S. did in the jungle to the communist takeover in all the Gulag states. And then, furthermore, the war didn't end there, because there's another 10 years of war in Cambodia with the Vietnamese occupation. That didn't really end until the end of the Cold War itself. So this cycle of violence that occurred after the end of World War II, when the Japanese Empire collapsed, in large part, the United States created this by funding the communist movements in Indochina. So, you know, it was just an all-around disastrous consequence that happened. But the next thing that's often brought up in the sort of new left interpretation of the Cold War is they have like two pet peeves in the 60s and 70s. There's the 1973 coup d'etat against Allende by Pinochet, and then in the 1965 counter-revolution by Suharto against the PKI forces in October 30th, 1965. Now, what they don't tell you about the Indonesia is that the PKI, which boasted itself as the third largest communist party in the world, under IDEET, was in communications with Zhou Enlai, who was offering to give them, you know, hundreds of thousands of rifles and millions of rounds of ammunition to lead a people's revolution in Indonesia. And it's interesting that the military officers that were killed in the initial coup were right-wing military officers, which seems to be problematic, because if it was a Suharto psyop, why would he kill his own loyalists? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And the way the new left narrative goes is that, well, it's this large communist party, and then was likely going to, you know, bring the joys of Maoism to Indonesia. That would have been a disaster. And then, you know, through massive genocide of millions of Chinese and native Chinese, Suharto took control over the country and made it a U.S. satellite state. Of course, the problem is Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. Now, the idea that the largest Muslim country in the world would somehow have the third largest communist party and be ripe for communist revolution is, in the face of it, laughable. And if you look at it, as in Iran, the imams were very militantly anti-communist and were in full support of Suharto. And there's a lot of grassroots support for Suharto from the Islamic population. So the idea that somehow this is because for them, for the new left, it's the popular sovereignty. It's got to be a popular movement, but it wasn't. I mean, it collapsed almost immediately. So they were the numbers of the PKI were most likely inflated, and the indigenous Islamic hostility as well. Another corollary to the Suharto issue is East Timor, which is, I think, where the new left is a bit more on the mark, where I think it was 74, 75 when Suharto's forces invaded under a brutal occupation, which I think it was Gerald Ford that sort of gave the, quote, green light to go. Now, there the new left is on firmer ground, except until Chomsky starts playing games saying that that's worse than Cambodia. I don't think it's worse than Cambodia, but we don't need to play that game to point out what a tragedy the occupation of East Timor was. then the other common one, because it occurred on 9/11, is the coup against Allende. Now, the idea, the narrative goes that Allende was this democratically, popularly elected leader who was the communist, and that the CIA tried to topple him because he was a communist front group in America. Well, as to whether the CIA directly aided or was involved in the overthrow of Allende has been debated. Certainly after the coup and Pinochet takes power, there is direct CIA support. But the thing is, Allende really was a Soviet puppet. He only ever won the 1970 election because he had hundreds of thousands of rubles pumped into his election campaign by the KGB. And in fact, his coalition government with the Christian Democrats was already unraveling in 72, 73, because these are, of course, they're the Christian Democrats. They don't want to be allied to a Soviet dictatorship puppet. And so Allende was a puppet of the Soviets, as they would claim Pinochet was a puppet of the United States. And in fact, he was close ties with Castro, because he was, at the time, the only other communist regime in the New World. And so the coup against Allende, again, was not like in Iran against Mossadegh. There were complicated forces involved that were not purely external. And in fact, if the new left is going to argue that Pinochet was an external psyop, and so was Allende, because he was a KGB man. So, but either way, though, Allende had already isolated key members of the coalition government that he had made promises to get elected in 1970. That when Pinochet does take power, he's able to take the lead and overthrow the communist regime. And if Cuba was any idea of what a new world communist regime would look like, Allende's Chile might not have been a very nice place to live in after 5-10 years of rule by a communist. And second of all, with both Suharto and Pinochet, as well as with Franco and others, and the Shah of Iran, the new left paints them as random murder, arrests, and terror. Well, that's actually what the communists do. The people that Pinochet, and Suharto were going after were communists, were terrorists. People that, had they won, would have set up, essentially, gulag states. There's the idea that they were just rounding up random innocent bystanders and shooting them in basements is just laughable. Obviously, the dragnets would catch some innocent people, but it wasn't like the order was just shoot random people to terrorize them. That's what Stalin would do. The purpose was to prevent any revolution by the communist forces. So I think both in Suharto and Pinochet, this new left narrative is very weak and flawed in that regard. Do you have anything to add to that, Keith?
Well, I think that the entire way in which a lot of the Cold War narratives have been framed is problematic from multiple directions. On the left end of the spectrum, as you pointed out, the way that the Cold War was always portrayed is you have third world countries that are struggling for their independence and for control over their own economies and political self-determination, democracy, and all these other kinds of things. They're like the American colonies of 1776. And then the United States imperialists are simply trying to prevent them from doing that in order to continue to exploit them from an economic perspective and things of that nature. Now, I think that there's some half-truths to that, in the sense that American intervention throughout the world, throughout the Third World in the Cold War period and today as well, was not simply about preventing communists from taking over individual governments. Just like today, it's not just about preventing Islamic terrorism and things of that nature. It's always been true that whatever kind of foreign policy apparatus, or what kind of foreign policy objectives the United States has had, there's in terms of geopolitical interests, whether it's terrorism or communism or whatever, there's always been this parallel objective, which is to maintain economic hegemony over these countries. It is really a continuation of what was done under the old colonial systems, where these places were economic colonies of the European colonial powers, and the Americans viewed themselves as the heirs to all of that after the post-war period, when those European colonial systems are no longer sustainable. So I think the left's narrative is half-truth, is a half-truth. Where the left goes wrong is the way that they have this tendency to portray anything that is anti-Western or anti-American or anti-capitalist or whatever as somehow being on the side of the angels, and that's how they end up, doing things like offering apologies for Pol Pot and Ho Chi Minh and Castro and all of these kinds of characters. I mean, if it weren't for this kind of the weaknesses that the left has in this area are purely ideological, in the sense that they have this strong belief in, egalitarian, universalist, humanist values, and anybody that claims to be fighting for these kinds of values or is able to appeal to that and exploit that, they seem extraordinarily vulnerable to, even when there's an infinite amount of evidence to the contrary that that's not what's really going on. For example, in the 60s, the line that the new left developed was that, yeah, Stalinism may be awful, but third world Marxism is something better. Meaning Maoism and Hoism and Castroism and all of this kind of stuff. Which I think is a really unbelievably foolish point of view. I mean, it's at least as ridiculous as people on the right wing who are apologists for Nazism and fascism and things of that nature. So on one hand, some of the left's critique of Western imperialism in the underdeveloped world is accurate, but it's where they always seem to go wrong is when they start having this idea that makes whoever's opposed to that the good guys. And it wasn't just that way with communists either. For example, when the Ayatollah's revolution was taking place in Iran, you had people in the West that were claiming this guy was another Gandhi, the Ayatollah Khomeini. So that's another issue as well. The left tends to fall for that very easily. I do think, though, that when it comes to American foreign policy, the Americans would have been opposed to anyone that was opposed to American hegemony in any of these places. Whether there was any Soviet Union or not, whether there was any communism or not. Like even if the Soviet Union had never existed during that time period, even if there was no such thing as communism, I still think that the Americans would have been just as opposed to any kind of self-determination movements in some of these countries that would have had the effect of conflicting with American geopolitical and economic interest, which is basically to extend the open door policy on a global basis. In fact, we see that happening after the Cold War. Like after the Cold War, there's no Soviet Union anymore, but American foreign policy becomes even more aggressive than it had ever been. And I think that American foreign policy probably would have been the same way during the like the neocon model of American foreign policy probably would have been American foreign policy during the Cold War if the Soviets and had not been there as a constraining force. Now, not that there was anything good about them, but it was just that kind of balance of power that resulted just as because of the accident of history. That tends to be how I view the Cold War. There's no good guys in this. It's basically power politics being played out on an international level by different groups that have their own objectives they're trying to advance. And we can argue that different groups had, created better societies than others. I don't think there's any doubt that the kind of Western liberal type of society is superior to communism. I mean, I think any reasonable person agrees with that. But it's the way that the narratives were framed, I think, are entirely problematic. It wasn't just, poor oppressed third world people being victimized by imperialism, and it wasn't just, the Americans fighting to make the world safe for democracy either. It was there was a lot more to it than that. One of my favorite writers on this subject, ironically, was a guy named Miles Copeland. Miles Copeland was a CIA operative way back in the 1950s, 60s. He was involved in the coup against Mossadegh in Tehran. He was a CIA station chief in Cairo at one point. So this guy was a very high level intelligence guy. Ironically, he's also the son of the father of the guys that started the band, the Police, Stuart Copeland and some of those guys. But that's a bit of interesting trivia there. But Miles Copeland had a book back in I guess it was in the early 80s. He wrote this, early to mid 80s, called The Game Player, where he talks about international relations, and he's talking in the context of the Cold War. But he had a very Machiavellian approach to foreign policy and international relations. He was very Kissinger-like in his approach to these things. It's all about like, yeah, we assassinate foreign leaders that don't uphold our interests. So what? What's wrong with that? That kind of perspective. That gangsterism and international relations is fine. You have to have a different set of morals when you're dealing with international relations than you say you would in your personal life. That kind of Machiavellian approach to statecraft. This guy was very much in that vein of thought. He was certainly very, very pro-American in terms of his view of American foreign policy and all of that. But he also, I think, had a very frank way of writing about things and analyzing things that you don't see in a lot of mainstream pundits and all of that. And he basically said that the basis of what was going on in the Cold War was that the Americans, because of their advanced industrial technological economy, wanted to simply have access to resources and raw materials all over the world, and the Soviets, were actually economically very backward, and their objective was to prevent the Americans from doing that. Trying to cut the Americans off from gaining that kind of economic hegemony, which they thought would hurt the Americans, domestically from an economic perspective. And what he argued is that the two sides, he argued that the Soviets would advance their own interests by creating all of these front movements, throughout the Third World. I mean, the reason that you had so many communist-led insurgent movements throughout the Third World was because of the power and prestige of the Soviet Union on one hand, and also because the Soviet Union actively supported these. I mean, they would give them weapons and money and tanks in some instances, and all, depending on the group and all of that. And that in turn really was the foundation of the Cold War. The Americans were more, the Russians were more military imperialists, and the Americans were more economic imperialists. That's more or less the way Copeland framed it, which I think is correct. I've never really seen an analysis of the Cold War that I thought was better than that. He said that, I'm looking for the quote here. Let's see. Yeah, he said that today's war between us and the Soviets is a mosaic of regional wars. The Soviet policy is one of denial, not to gain territory from themselves, but to deny us, to deprive us of the raw materials from Africa, cobalt, magnesium, chromium that we have to have for a highly technological society like ours. Now, if you heard that quote taken out of context, it sounds almost like Noam Chomsky, but this guy was actually CIA station chief in Cairo. He was, again, a Kissinger model approach to statecraft, very Machiavellian oriented, which is interesting. But none of that really, says anything about the nature of these communist societies. I mean, I have always viewed communism as red fascism or red Nazism. Like there was a leftist writer named Susan Sontag who, back in the 70s, early 80s, said that what is communism but red Nazis or red fascists or something like that. I forget the exact quote, but that's exactly what it is. It's the same system, if not worse. Fascism, I think, is arguably a more livable system than communism, excluding Nazism. I think Nazism is sort of a hybrid of communism and fascism, and plus all this weird racial mysticism that you don't really find in either traditional communism or fascism. But the way that these narratives are framed, I think, are just way off the mark in the sense because they have so many different vested interests that try to slant the narrative in their own direction.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think, though, that where I'm a little different than a lot of the libertarian or anti-hawk position is I think that in the Cold War, the United States, I agree the United States would have been aggressive anyhow. I mean, we We fought Japan for the same reasons, for resources. We fought Germany in 2 world wars for the same reason, for global hegemony. But I think in this particular case, that aligned in a couple areas with doing something that would prevent a worse evil, like the triumph of communism. But one of the things for the end game of the Cold War, where the Soviet Union finally unravels and it falls apart, geopolitically, it's Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the crucial turning point for the Soviet Union geopolitically, because after the Tsar Revolution, where they overthrew the secular government of Afghanistan, the communists couldn't stay in power. They said we just couldn't do it. The Mujahideen were, they're Islamic fundamentalists. They don't want to have an atheist regime that's going to genocide them, take over. So the communist government calls in the Soviet forces and to occupy the region for I think it was 10 years, almost 10 years anyhow. And of course, the United States uses a chance to get back at the Soviets, Vietnam in reverse. One of the things that's interesting in a lot of these conflicts of which Afghanistan is one, but we see it in Angola as well, that the New Left narrative always talks about the U.S.-backed forces. Okay, China was just as prevalent in backing these forces as was the United States. And second of all, they were sort of their own group as well. But one of the warnings that the Reagan administration was given was that, look, you got to be careful who you give money to, because you don't know exactly who's going to get this money. And of course, one of the things that happened is the Al Qaeda, which we'll cover in the final installation, was in part created by this sort of context of containing the Soviets. Now, from a purely geopolitical point of view, the American economic and military aid to the Mujahideen was a brilliant coup, because ultimately it brought down the Soviets. Because what happened was, when the Soviet army, their veterans came back and got the Vietnam treatment, when the regime needed them in the 90s, they're like, screw you, you threw us under the bus after Afghanistan. We're not going to help you out. And, because really the Russian autocratic regimes can generally stay in power if the military is behind them. In 1917, when the Tsar lost control of the army, he fell from power. In 1991, when the Soviet Union lost control of the army, they fell from power. In an autocratic regime, you can never lose support of the military. And of course, Afghanistan was how they lost that support. From a broader geostrategic point of view, though, the Soviet Union never really had a chance to win the Cold War. As you pointed out earlier, Keith, the Soviet Union was far less economically developed than the United States. I mean, it's primarily its industry was military. It was developed on the military. Rockets, missiles, tanks, machine guns. They didn't have a diversified butter economy like the Western powers did. People were still living in the 1980s, had a standard of living not much different than the 1950s. Whereas the United States, people had televisions and radios, and what was just coming out was, I think, like the Walkman, and the first, for the very rich, the first cell phones that were the size of a brick. And then this the access to amenities like movie theaters and amusement parks and whatnot, and consumption of consumer goods like different foods or plastic. I mean, the Soviet Union never even got a decent tampon, for crying out loud. Seriously, it's like the 1980s and you still don't have one. The Soviet economy was just, the only chance the Soviets had was subversion. And, Yuri Bezmenov, the Soviet KGB defector, who talks about subversion, says that, they sort of knew that. They knew that in the long run they had to weaken our will, which is actually a really good place to go for, because Sun Tzu and Clausewitz both agree it's the will of the enemy you have to break. And so these subversion tactics would be a natural way to do it. But at the end of the day, the Cold War was a war of attrition, economic attrition. And the United States and its allies not only had more natural resources, but they better utilized those natural resources. China had tremendous human capital and resource capital, but under the insanity of Mao, it was wasted. And by the time Deng Xiaoping is taking over, he's already split with the Soviets. So, in fact, the Chinese were almost as hawkish as we were in fighting the Soviets. They would complain at times that we weren't being more like during the administration of, oh, I can't think of his name now, the guy after Ford, Carter. After Carter, that he wasn't fighting the Soviets hard enough. So by that point, the communist world had already been split, and those resources were then being used in ways that could not be effectively to fight the West. In fact, I think the Soviets had more troops deployed in East Asia against a possible Chinese invasion than they did against NATO forces in Western Europe. So in that sense, the Soviets were really in no position to actually win the Cold War. But with Afghanistan in particular, though, they really made a lot of mistakes. Because generally, the non-allied Third World factions tended to be mildly pro-Soviet, because they tended to view the Americans as imperialists, and they tended to buy the line of the Soviets as being, these supporters of the underdog. But when they invaded Afghanistan, almost all the non-allied nations were like, okay, this has got to stop. And then the Islamic world was galvanized, leading to basically in Afghanistan is when the Islamic world copied the sort of third world revolutionary mentality that the Soviets had used, the communists had used beginning since the Spanish Civil War, where you have these, foreign volunteers going to fight for the revolution. Well, now it's the jihad. But they actually copied that strategy and used it successfully against the Soviets. And once they had money being dumped in from China and the United States, and the inability of the Soviets to shut down the Pashtun regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan, much the same problem that the United States has had in Afghanistan recently, it was only a matter of time before they would then have to withdraw, because they didn't have the stomach to hold the country down, just like the United States didn't have the stomach to hold South Vietnam down. And at that point, we begin to see, among other things, among all the other pressures, the economic competition with the United States, Star Wars, the anti-missile defense system, and in certain respects as well, we'll touch on this later, but the military firepower that was shown in the first Gulf War really showed the communist world how far behind they were. They had some cutting-edge military technology, but it wasn't in the numbers needed to actually compete with the West. And it wasn't the level of military readiness wasn't as high as the West either. They were kind of a one-trick pony. They had lots of numbers, and they had to win quickly with their overwhelming force if there was ever a hot war in Europe. But if it lasted for any great length of time, their economy and the logistics would begin to break down. And I think at the end that was what did the Soviets in. The most important thing in the 80s from the U.S. perspective was the change of policy beginning with Ronald Reagan. From the end of the Cold War, from the end of World War II, rather, up until Ronald Reagan, the reigning paradigm was a kind of coexistence. We're just going to coexist with the Soviets. They're always going to be there. International communism and the threat of nuclear annihilation is always going to be with us. We just have to have some nuances in the actual setup. Reagan takes a different tack and says, no, we're going to win this Cold War and we're going to take down the Soviets. Now, of course, he knew a hot war was off the table, but there were other measures that one could take to undermine the Soviet empire. There was the tying them down in Afghanistan, the arms race, using Radio Free Europe to spread propaganda to the Eastern Bloc countries, and as well as the whole carrot and the stick of U.S. political power. But now we had a U.S. president that was willing to play hardball with the Soviets and wasn't going to back down and wasn't going to finagle or haggle. I mean, even the veteran Eisenhower kind of rolled over in Korea. By that point, I guess he was just ready for it to be over. But once you had an American president that was willing to stand against the Soviets and push them where it hurt, and at this point they'd been in power for since the end of the Cold World War II for 40 odd years now, and people are beginning to realize life is better in the West. And you can't shut out the outside world forever. And at the end of the day, it just all came crumbling down. And one of the interesting things that we'll see later is the color revolutions begin in the 1980s with the Velvet, I think it was the Velvet Revolutions in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Poland, funded by the people like George Soros. So, you think you want to add on that, Keith?
Well, the when Afghanistan, when the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979, I remember at the time hearing commentators saying things like, "This will be for the Soviet Union what Vietnam was for the United States." And it more or less turned out to have that kind of effect in the sense that it was a war that was dragged out for almost 10 years. It became very unpopular within domestic Soviet society. There was high casualties and all of that. And then I think that has contributed significantly to the unraveling of the Soviet Union, because not only did the Soviet Union have this backward, technologically, economically underdeveloped economy, but now they also had this war that was going on. That was this, and people looked at this like, well, what's the point? Why are we even bothering with this thing in Afghanistan? And one thing, though, about the standard of living in the Soviet Union is, you mentioned how in the 1980s they still had a 1950s standard of living, things like that. I think that may be overly optimistic. In the cities, in the larger cities, like in Moscow and places like that in the Soviet Union, they were decades behind the United States in terms of living standards. But in the rural areas in the Soviet countries, some of those were still in the Middle Ages practically. I know I had a professor when I was in college who had ventured to the Soviet Union. He had gone to Moscow in the early 1960s, which would have been during the Khrushchev era. And he talked about how, if you saw one thing if you were in the cities, but he talks about having toured the countryside in the Soviet Union. And the people looked like scenes out of the Middle Ages. There really was a peasant, third world like society. So the Soviet Union was always way behind. In more recent years, I've heard them described as upper Volta, only with nuclear weapons. And that's probably not too far off. So not only was the level of economic development way behind, and not only were they not able to compete with the West in terms of providing a comparable standard of living, but they also had this unpopular war going on. I do think, though, that along the way in the Soviet Union, as the end of the Cold War came, you had more and more opinion forming among the Soviet leadership that they had to do something to change their system, or they were going to die as a system. For example, Yuri Andropov became the prime minister or the premier, whatever. Yeah, the premier. I guess it was in 1981. It was after Brezhnev died. I guess it was in 1981. Yuri Andropov, who had actually been head of the KGB, so a hardline communist, actually came to power, and he was actually interested in liberalizing the economy of not the society, but the economy of the Soviet Union, to go in more of a Chinese direction. It was around this time that Deng and China was starting to move China towards some more liberal economic reforms for purposes of economic development. And Yuri Andropov was actually interested in moving in that direction in Russia as well. He was only there for a short time and died, and then he was replaced by Konstantin Chernenko, who died shortly afterwards. I mean, by this time, the leadership of the Politburo and all that, the Soviet Communist Party, these guys were all in their 80s at this point. So each new guy died after about 3 months in office or something. And then when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, I guess it was, he was somewhat younger. He was in his 50s at the time. But he, I think, started to continue some of the policies that Andropov had wanted to put into place, which was to liberalize the economy so that they wouldn't be such a backward economy. Although I think Gorbachev took it bit further, and he also wanted to have greater liberalization in the society as well. Now, he certainly didn't want to dismantle the Soviet Union. I don't see any evidence that he ultimately had that as a plan. I think he simply wanted to make the Soviet Union more of a liberal society, in terms of economic development, and perhaps, a little less Stalinist in terms of its domestic society as well. But I think that when Gorbachev started implementing certain reforms, that kind of let the cat out of the bag, in the sense that if you, what tends to happen in a lot of societies is that rebellion will start after a long period of repression. After a long period of repression, a little bit of liberalization starts to begin, and then rebellion starts to escalate. So I think more and more people in those regions started to demand more and more rights and more economic liberalization and things like that. And of course, one of the crucial moments was when Solidarity, the Polish labor union, staged something of a rebellion against the Soviet the Soviet puppet state in Poland, and the Russians declined to intervene. I've actually heard it said that initially the Russians declined to intervene in Poland, in part because they were afraid of American retaliation. Because of as you were pointing out, the Reagan administration was in power in the United States at the time, and they took a very hawkish perspective on the Cold War. But increasingly, though, I think what really made that situation was it set a precedent where in the late 80s, when those nations started to collapse, when Romania and under Ceausescu and East Germany under Erich Honecker and some of those other countries started to collapse, the Soviets failed to send in tanks to crush the rebellion, which they had previously done, which they had done in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and Germany in 1961 and Poland and Hungary in 1956. So because of that, I think that the Eastern European nations got their independence, and I think that really kind of set the ball rolling for the Soviet Union to eventually fall apart, because then the 15 republics basically seceded from the Soviet Union as well, to the point that there was really nothing left of the Soviet Union. They simply disbanded it. So it was sort of this process of unraveling that took place over about a 10-year period. And I think that there's a lot of things that caused that. The nature of the Soviet system itself was a big part of it. The fact that it was such an ineffective system that even its leadership, I think, started realizing, well, we've got to change something at some point. I'm not sure. As far as foreign policy and how that influenced that, certainly the war in Afghanistan, I think, was part of the death knell for the Soviet Union as well. As for the arms race, I'm not sure to what degree that really had the effect of undermining the Soviet Union, because the Soviets always put so much of their resources into armaments anyway. I don't know that marked a really significant change for them. They were always sort of a military first society, and not unlike the North Koreans are now, perhaps not quite as extreme, but they had a similar set of policies. In fact, one thing about the Soviet system is that it was actually expensive for them to maintain their satellites in Eastern Europe. A lot of these Eastern European satellites actually had higher standards of living than the Soviet Union itself did, or Russia itself did. And in part, I think that was because one of the things that the Russians did, the Soviets did, to maintain control over those satellites was they would put so many resources into maintaining control over those, that they neglected a lot of stuff within the actual Soviet Union, or even within the Russian heartland. So that, I think, probably created a lot of discontent among the Russians and among the Soviet population generally. But the main thing about their system, I think, is that it was something that just wasn't sustainable in the long run. I mean, the more that people who had traveled to the West, or people who were familiar with the outside world, became aware of how far behind they were, the more discontent with the system they became. I've actually heard analysis of this from communists, from people who were apologists for the Soviet Union, uh, who would say that one of the problems is that people in the in, or quote unquote a problem was that people in the Soviet Union got to the point where they wanted to participate in all the things that the West had in terms of the consumer culture, the higher standard of living, political freedom, and things of that nature. Particularly intellectuals, particularly young people, and all of that. So the Soviet system just started to lose its legitimacy.
Yeah. We're about out of time. Is there anything you'd want to end with, Keith?
Uh, well, as far as the Cold War, I think that it's interesting because it's really the one of the last. It may end up being one of the last times in history that you have this kind of standoff between armed powers to the degree that we did. It's interesting that never. Of course, the big fear during the Cold War is that there was going to be nuclear exchange between the major powers. But I think, though, that the effect of having this, weapons of mass destruction and having major powers that had these capabilities, I think in some ways that actually may have prevented war to a much greater degree than what would have been the case. I think that if there had been no nuclear weapons during the Cold War, if both states, the Soviet and its allies and the United States and their allies had had only conventional weapons of the kind that were available, prior to World War II, I suspect it would have been much, much more likely that there would have been a hot war between the two powers. I could very easily have seen the United States and the Soviet Union having a hot war with one another using conventional weapons. I think, though, that the availability and presence of nuclear weapons raised the cost of war to the point where it became cost prohibitive, where nobody on any side was willing to risk that. Not even crazy people like Mao Zedong. And so I think that that's a really interesting scenario that really transformed the nature of war. We have modern theorists, contemporary theorists of war, who say that this did have a transformative effect by raising the cost of war, to where now what war is about is not so much wars between states as between non-state actors and states. You have states, and then you have state weakening in places, and non-state actors trying to assert the role of states. And really, most war today is waged by non-state actors. So, like the Vietnam War, I think the Cold War had this kind of transformative effect as well.
Yeah. I think what I'd like to end with is that the Cold War, it was unusual in the sense that it was a bipolar world, and then the initial monopolar world that followed it was highly unnatural. Throughout the history of Eurasia and the world, there's usually competing power centers, and we're beginning to see a return to these competing power centers. And I think a lot of this has to do with the result of the destruction of these competing power centers in World War II. Germany, Japan, France, and England were all devastated. And then so was Russia, but Russia was large enough to sort of walk away from it. And we also saw that larger demographic trends, pointed out by people like Lothrop Stoddard as early as the 1920s, which, demographic trends, religious trends, that were largely covered over by World War II and the Cold War, are now reasserting themselves. Stoddard predicted in the 1920s that Islam would be a new threat to the West. Seems laughable at the time, but well, he was right. But he looked at the deeper underlying factors. So I think in a lot of sense, the sort of big picture issues that the Cold War dealt with were largely synthetic and unnatural. And once the Soviets collapsed, and the United States empire will ultimately, I think, likely collapse due to overextension. Back to what we mentioned about the Spanish-American War, Spain fell because it overextended its empire, and that was the basis of the anti-imperialist league argument. And I think we're going to fall into that as well. But these sort of underlying currents and trends, which we'll explore more in our final installment, are the ones that truly mattered and are reasserting themselves as these sort of powerful empires of the U.S. and Soviet forces. The Soviets collapse, and I think the U.S. is arguably in the process of collapsing. But this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.